Frederick tightened the fraying knot of his tie, the one Rose had bought him years ago when they still believed love could conquer anything. He adjusted the worn collar of his white shirt, its crispness long gone after endless cycles of hand-washing in their cramped apartment. The mirror reflected a man who looked humble, but inside, Frederick simmered with a fury he had mastered the art of hiding. From the dining room below, the laughter of Rose's family echoed like nails scraping against his pride. They didn't even try to lower their voices. Can you believe he couldn't even pay for dinner last night? A man who can't afford a meal has no business marrying Rose. Pathetic, another voice added, dripping with disdain. She was a fool to throw her life away for him. Fred gritted his teeth and looked away from his reflection. These were the same people who had once praised Rose as the crown jewel of their family, the beloved daughter who could do no wrong. But the moment she had defied them to marry him, they had stripped her of that pedestal, leaving her to fend for herself in a world she barely understood. Fred never regretted marrying Rose. Not once. But as he looked out of the window at the glittering skyline of the city, his hands curled into fists. He couldn't forget the humiliation she endured every day at the hands of her family, his family by law. And he couldn't forgive the Browns for turning their backs on her when she needed them most. Rose had been everything he wasn't: beautiful, privileged, confident. She walked into a room and people noticed. They admired her grace, her boldness, her flawless charm. Fred had been the opposite, a quiet boy from a modest background who had worked part-time jobs just to get through college. Yet, when Rose chose him, it was like a fairy tale. She didn't care that he wasn't rich. She didn't care about her parents' warnings that love alone wouldn't be enough. But the fairy tale didn't last. After Rose's father disowned her, life became a struggle. Gone were the designer dresses and luxury cars. Gone were the friends who had only been there for the glamour. The once spoiled heiress was thrust into a life of scraping by, counting pennies, and facing the cold stares of people who used to envy her. Fred watched as her spirit hardened over time. The girl who had once laughed at life's challenges now sat in silence, her face a mask of disappointment and resentment. And Fred couldn't blame her. She had given up everything for him, and in return, she had lost her place in the world. Dinner with the Browns was an event Fred had come to dread. Every visit was the same. Rose's parents would invite them over under the guise of reconciliation, only to hurl thinly veiled insults at him. Her brothers and sisters, seated around the grand dining table, would smirk and nod in agreement, their wine glasses clinking as they shared smug glances. Tonight was no different. Frederick, Rose's father, began, his voice dripping with condescension. "How's that job search going? Still struggling to find a real career?" Fred's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "I'm working on it, sir." "Oh, he's always working on it," Rose's mother said with a laugh. "Pity nothing ever comes of it." Fred didn't respond. He reached for his water glass, gripping it tightly to keep himself from saying something he couldn't take back. His eyes flicked to Rose, who sat stiffly beside him. She avoided his gaze, her shoulders tense as if bracing for the next verbal attack. It wasn't until they were back in their apartment that Rose finally spoke. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Fred leaned against the counter, exhausted. "Because it's not about me, Rose. It's about you. If I fight back, they'll take it out on you, and I won't let that happen." Rose shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not enough, Fred. I thought we could make this work, but I feel like I'm drowning." Fred wanted to tell her everything, that he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he had the power to turn their lives around in an instant. But the words caught in his throat. His plan wasn't ready. And if she knew the truth now, she might never forgive him for lying. "I'll fix it," he promised softly. "I'll make it better." Rose stared at him for a long moment before turning away. "You've been saying that for years." Fred watched her retreat to the bedroom, her silhouette framed by the dim light of their single lamp. He clenched his fists, the weight of his secret crushing him. He had to succeed. He had to make the Browns pay for what they'd done to her. And when it was all over, he would tell her everything, if she still wanted to hear it. The night air was cold as Frederick stepped onto the small balcony of their apartment. He leaned against the rusted railing, staring out at the flickering lights of the city below. The hum of distant traffic filled the silence, but his mind was louder, a storm of thoughts raging as he tried to make sense of it all. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages from his secret contacts, business associates, lawyers, and allies from a life he had kept hidden from Rose. Each message was a piece of the puzzle, a step closer to dismantling the Brown family's empire. But as he looked at the names and numbers, a bitter thought crossed his mind. Would it even matter if he succeeded? Would Rose still be there when it was all over? Inside, Rose sat on the edge of their bed, her hands trembling as she held an old photo in her lap. It was a picture of her and Fred from their college days, taken at a park where they had spent countless afternoons dreaming about the future. They looked so happy then, so full of hope. She ran her fingers over the photo, her chest tightening as the memories flooded back. Back then, she had been naive, believing that love could conquer all. She had thought that as long as they were together, nothing else mattered. But life had a cruel way of shattering illusions. The Browns had made her feel worthless, but their words weren't what hurt the most. It was Fred's silence. His refusal to stand up for himself, for them, made her feel like they were fighting a losing battle. And the worst part, she was starting to doubt him. "What are you hiding, Fred?" She whispered to the empty room. Fred's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a name that made his stomach churn. Angela. Angela, his personal assistant and friend, was the only person who knew the full extent of his plan. She had been there when he first discovered his true lineage, encouraging him to embrace the power and wealth he had inherited. But Fred's relationship with Angela was complicated. She was more than an ally, but less than a friend, and Rose would never understand her role in his life. He hesitated before answering, his voice low. "Angela." "Fred, we need to talk," she said, her tone brisk. "The deal with the real estate holdings went through. That's one more nail in the Browns' coffin." Fred's grip tightened on the phone. "Good. What's next?" "There's one more move to make, but it's risky," Angela continued. "Are you ready for the fallout?" Fred's gaze drifted back to the apartment window, where he could see Rose's silhouette pacing inside. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "I have to do this for her." Angela sighed. "You're playing a dangerous game, Fred. Be careful, or you'll lose her for good." Fred ended the call without responding. He knew Angela was right, but he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The following morning, Fred woke to an empty bed. Rose was already up, standing by the window with her arms crossed. She was dressed for another tense family meeting, her tailored black dress a reminder of the life she had left behind. "You're up early," Fred said, his voice still heavy with sleep. Rose didn't turn to face him. "I couldn't sleep." He walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched at his touch, and the distance between them felt like a chasm. "Rose, talk to me," he pleaded. "What's going on?" She finally turned, her hazel eyes blazing. "What's going on? I'll tell you, Fred. I'm tired of the lies, the secrets, the humiliation. Every day I wonder if I made the biggest mistake of my life by marrying you." Her words cut deeper than any insult from the Browns ever could. Fred stepped back, his chest tightening. "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" she shot back. "I gave up everything for you, Fred. My family, my friends, my life. And what do I have to show for it? A husband who won't tell me the truth." Fred struggled to find the right words, but nothing he said would fix this. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not until he had finished what he started. "Rose, save it," she said, grabbing her purse. "I'm going to my parents. At least they don't pretend to be something they're not." Fred watched helplessly as she walked out the door, leaving him alone with his thoughts. At the Browns' mansion, Rose sat stiffly in the living room, enduring another lecture from her mother. "You could have had everything, Rose," her mother said, swirling her glass of wine. "But instead, you chose him. And for what? Love?" She laughed bitterly. "Love doesn't pay the bills, darling." Rose clenched her fists, biting back a sharp retort. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them that they didn't understand Fred, that they didn't understand her. But a part of her knew they were right. As her mother droned on, Rose's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. "Ask Fred about Angela. Her heart stopped. Rose sat frozen, the phone still in her hand. The text felt like a physical blow, an intrusion into the fragile wall she had built around her marriage. Angela? The name meant nothing to her, but the way it was framed sent her mind spiraling. Her mother's voice faded into the background as Rose stared at the words on the screen. Who would send such a message, and why? She tucked the phone back into her purse, forcing herself to keep a neutral expression. Whatever this was, she needed to approach it carefully. Are you even listening to me, Rose? Her mother snapped, breaking her train of thought. Yes, Mother, Rose replied, her tone flat. I heard every word. Her mother sighed dramatically. You're so much like your father, stubborn to the point of self-destruction, but don't say I didn't warn you. Rose stood abruptly, smoothing down her dress. If you'll excuse me, I have somewhere to be. Her mother didn't bother to hide her disapproval as Rose walked out, her heels clicking against the marble floors. But Rose didn't care. She had bigger things to worry about. By the time Rose returned to the apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across their small living room. Frederick was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The sight would have warmed her heart once, but now it only fueled her suspicion. Who's Angela? She asked, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Fred froze, the knife hovering midair. He turned to face her slowly, his expression carefully neutral. What? You heard me, Rose said, crossing her arms. Who is Angela, and why would someone tell me to ask you about her? Fred set the knife down, his mind racing. He had been so careful to keep Angela's involvement hidden. How had Rose found out? She's just a business contact, he said finally, his voice calm. Nothing more. Rose's eyes narrowed. A business contact? That's all? Yes, Fred insisted, meeting her gaze. She's helping me with some investments. That's it. Rose searched his face for any sign of a lie, but Fred had perfected the art of masking his emotions. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it refused to be ignored. Why didn't you tell me about her before? She pressed. Because it wasn't relevant, Fred said, his tone growing defensive. I didn't think it mattered. Rose shook her head, her chest tightening. You didn't think it mattered to tell your wife about a woman you're working with? How am I supposed to trust you, Fred? Fred stepped closer, his voice softening. Rose, I'm doing everything I can to make things better for us. You have to believe me. I want to believe you, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm tired of being kept in the dark. Fred reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The distance between them felt insurmountable, a chasm neither of them knew how to cross. That night, Fred lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Rose had gone to bed hours ago, her back turned to him, her breathing shallow and uneven. He thought about the life they used to have, the late-night talks, the laughter, the way she used to look at him like he was her whole world. But that world had crumbled, and he couldn't blame her for the pieces they were left with. Fred reached for his phone, scrolling through old photos of them together. One picture caught his eye. Rose standing in front of their first apartment, her face lit up with joy. She had been so proud of their little home, even though it was far from the luxury she was used to. I'm sorry, Rose, he whispered into the darkness. I'll fix this, I promise. The next day, Fred met Angela in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. She was already seated when he arrived, her sleek black dress and sharp features drawing more than a few curious glances. You look terrible, she said as Fred sat down across from her. Thanks, he muttered. Nice to see you too. Angela smirked, but her tone turned serious. We have a problem. Fred leaned forward, his expression dark. What kind of problem? Someone's digging into your background, Angela said, sliding a folder across the table. I don't know who, but they're getting close. Fred opened the folder, his stomach sinking as he scanned the documents. Whoever was behind this knew more than they should, about his inheritance, his plans, even his connection to Angela. We need to shut this down, he said, his voice low. I can't afford for Rose to find out. Angela raised an eyebrow. Still keeping her in the dark, huh? You think she'll forgive you when this all blows up? Fred glared at her. That's none of your business. Angela shrugged, leaning back in her chair. Suit yourself, but you'd better figure out who's behind this before it's too late. Meanwhile, Rose was at home, pacing the living room with Fred's laptop open on the coffee table. He had left it unlocked, and for the first time, curiosity got the better of her. She scrolled through emails and documents, her heart pounding as she uncovered pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand. Names she didn't recognize, financial transactions that made no sense, and repeated mentions of Angela. Her chest tightened as a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Whatever Fred was hiding, it was bigger than she had imagined. The sound of the front door opening snapped her out of her thoughts. She quickly closed the laptop and stood, her heart racing as Fred walked in. "Hey," he said, his expression wary. "Everything okay?" Rose forced a smile, her hands trembling behind her back. "Yeah, everything's fine." But deep down, she knew their fragile world was on the brink of collapse. Fred woke up the next morning feeling the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The silence between him and Rose was suffocating. The space that had once been filled with love now felt like an unbridgeable gulf, and every time he glanced at her, his guilt grew heavier. He had promised himself that he would take down the Browns, the family that had wronged Rose so many times, but in doing so, he had buried his own identity, and with it, the truth about who he really was. He had hidden his wealth, his power, his true legacy, all to protect Rose from the bitter reality of their situation. But now, the truth was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't control the unraveling threads. Fred leaned against the kitchen counter, rubbing his temples. Today was crucial. He had to make a decision. Would he tell Rose the truth and risk losing her forever, or would he continue this charade until he had taken down the Browns? Every path felt like a dead end. Rose stood by the window in their small apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft beams of light on the hardwood floor, but it did little to lift her mood. Her thoughts were heavy with the knowledge that something wasn't right with Fred. She had always trusted him, always believed in their love. But as the days passed, that trust was starting to crack. The more she dug, the more questions she found, and the answers were nowhere to be found. She couldn't keep living like this, caught between the man she loved and the man she didn't recognize anymore. It was time to confront him, to make him choose, her or the lies. That evening, as Fred returned home after another long day of business, Rose was waiting for him. The apartment was dimly lit, a few candles flickering in the background, setting an almost eerie mood. She had spent hours preparing herself for this moment, knowing it would change everything. "Fred, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but low, like a storm brewing in the distance. Fred froze at the doorway, a mixture of dread and anticipation swirling in his chest. He could see it in her eyes. This wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. This was the moment where everything would come crashing down. "I've been thinking a lot," Rose continued, her gaze unwavering. "I need to know the truth. I don't care about your reasons anymore. I just need to know who you really are." Fred swallowed hard, his throat dry. The time had come. He could feel the tension building between them, a fragile thread holding them together, about to snap. "Rose," Fred started, his voice rough, "I'm not the man you think I am." She met his gaze with steely determination. "I figured as much." Fred stepped closer, his heart racing. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought—" "You thought what?" Rose interrupted, her voice rising. "That I wouldn't notice? That you could keep lying to me forever?" Fred took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. This was it, the moment when everything could either shatter or start to heal. "I'm not a nobody, Rose. I'm not just some poor guy who married you because I had no choice." Rose's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Fred?" He looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The words felt heavier now, as if they carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. "I come from money, Rose. A lot of it. I didn't want to marry you for your family's wealth, but it's the only way to destroy them. I've been pretending to be someone I'm not, just to take revenge for everything they've done to you." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Rose stared at him, her mind racing. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This doesn't make sense." Fred shook his head, frustration mounting. "I wish I were, but I'm not. You think I've been hiding my wealth because I'm ashamed? No, I've been hiding it because I knew if you knew the truth, you'd never forgive me." Rose took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to spin as the full weight of Fred's confession sank in. She had always believed in their love, in their shared dream of a life together, but now that dream felt like a lie. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" she asked, her voice trembling. "For how long, Fred?" "Since the beginning," Fred admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I didn't want you to see me as some rich, spoiled heir. I wanted you to love me for me. But the truth is, I'm using this marriage to destroy your family. I had no other choice." Rose turned away from him, her body shaking as the flood of emotions crashed over her. She had always believed Fred when he said he loved her, but now she felt like a fool. The love she had cherished for so long suddenly felt tainted by the lies. "You don't get it, Fred," she choked out, her voice breaking. "You say you're doing this for me, but you're destroying everything we built. You lied to me, to my face, every single day." Fred stood motionless, his heart breaking as he watched the woman he loved crumble in front of him. He had never wanted this. He never wanted to see her in pain. But now, it seemed inevitable. "I didn't know how to tell you, Rose," he whispered. "I thought you'd hate me. I thought I could protect you from the truth." Rose turned back to face him, her eyes filled with anger and hurt. "Protect me? You've only betrayed me." The silence between them was deafening. Neither of them knew what to say next. Their marriage, once full of hope and passion, was now standing on the edge of a precipice. "Fred, I don't know what to do with this," Rose said, her voice hollow. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Fred's chest tightened. This was the moment where everything could slip away. He had to make her see. He wasn't just doing this for revenge. He was doing it to protect her, to make things right. "I love you, Rose," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I always have, but I had to do this. I had to fight for you, for your dignity. And if you can't forgive me, I'll understand. But please, let me fix this. Let me prove to you that I'm not just the man you think I am." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't know if she could forgive him. Not yet. Not when everything felt like it had been built on a lie. As Fred turned to leave, his heart shattered with every step he took. He had always known this moment would come, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he could live with the consequences. The days that followed were some of the hardest for Rose. She couldn't escape the truth. Fred had lied to her, manipulated her emotions, all for some grand plan of revenge against the Browns. The weight of his betrayal was suffocating. But even amidst her anger, something deep inside her stirred, a flicker of the love they had once shared, before the lies. She would never forget the man she thought he was, the love that had once felt so pure. But now, everything was shattered. And the hardest part? She wasn't sure if she could let go of him. Rose spent hours pacing their small apartment, her mind whirling with conflicting thoughts. On one hand, the lies had broken her trust in Fred beyond repair, and the idea that their love was nothing more than a weapon he wielded for revenge made her sick. But on the other hand, could she deny the sincerity in his eyes? Could she truly walk away from the man she had once given her heart to? When Fred returned home late one night, Rose was waiting. She had been restless, caught between her pain and her need for answers. "Why, Fred?" she asked softly, her voice raw from days of unshed tears. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" Fred stopped in the doorway, his hands shaking slightly. He could feel the distance between them, the invisible wall that had risen. "I thought if you knew who I really was, you'd see me as nothing more than a rich man using you for his own gain. I thought you'd hate me." Rose looked at him, her face a mask of cold determination. "And now," Fred swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Now, I don't know what you think of me, but I love you, Rose. That's the only truth I've ever told you." The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. But Rose was no longer the naive, hopeless romantic she had once been. Her heart had been broken, her trust shattered, and now she was standing on the edge of a precipice. "I need time, Fred. Time to think. Time to decide what to do with this mess you've made." She turned away, her back to him as the silence stretched out between them. Fred stood there, a man caught between love and regret, knowing he couldn't force her to forgive him. He had ruined everything, and now it was up to Rose to decide if their love could survive the storm. While Fred battled with his guilt, and Rose wrestled with her conflicting emotions, another player in their game began to stir. A figure from Fred's past, someone who had always kept an eye on him. Elena Val, a woman who had once been more than just a casual lover, but now played a different role in his life. Elena was as ruthless as she was beautiful, and she had been instrumental in Fred's rise to power. When Fred had disappeared from the social scene, she had kept watch over his business empire, ensuring it thrived while he stayed in the shadows. But now, as Fred's marriage unraveled and his life teetered on the edge, Elena saw an opportunity to regain the control she had once had over him. She had always known about Fred's true identity, but she hadn't expected him to marry Rose. He had always been a man of ambition, but when he had chosen to stay in the background for Rose's sake, Elena had seen it as weakness. And she wasn't about to let him throw it all away. Elena's quiet manipulation was something Fred couldn't ignore. As much as he tried to distance himself from her, she had a way of inserting herself into his life, making him question everything. Fred had always known Elena was capable of anything to get what she wanted, but now he was afraid she would be the one to destroy what was left of his marriage. As Fred grappled with his inner demons, Elena began to make her move. She started to reinsert herself into Fred's world, offering her support, her comfort, and ultimately her influence. She was a master of manipulation, and she knew exactly how to play the game. Elena's presence was subtle at first, an occasional message or a chance encounter at business meetings. But soon, she began showing up more frequently, always in the right place at the right time. She knew how to read Fred's vulnerabilities, how to show him sympathy when he needed it most. At one of their late-night meetings, as Fred sat across from Elena in a dimly lit cafe, she leaned forward, her voice low and smooth. "You don't have to do this alone, Fred. You don't have to carry the weight of your past and your future by yourself. I've always been here for you." Fred hesitated, his guilt still eating at him, but Elena's words wrapped around him like a lifeline. "I don't know if I can trust anyone right now," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. She smiled gently, a knowing glint in her eyes. "I understand, but I've always been on your side. Unlike Rose, you've seen what she's capable of. You don't need someone like that when you have someone who's been with you through everything." The words cut deeper than Fred was willing to admit, and though he tried to push them away, the doubts began to creep in. Was he really doing the right thing? Was Rose really the partner he had once believed her to be? Elena's influence was working, slowly but surely. Rose, meanwhile, was not unaware of the whispers around Fred. She had seen the way Elena looked at him, the way she lingered in his orbit, despite the supposed distance between them. And as much as Rose wanted to ignore it, she couldn't. Every day, she found herself second-guessing her decisions, wondering if she could ever trust Fred again, or if his connection with Elena was something deeper than just a lingering past. She had never seen Elena's true motives, but the woman's sudden reappearance in Fred's life only added fuel to the fire of Rose's uncertainty. The emotional whirlwind inside her was only amplified when Elena made a bold move, showing up at the apartment one night, uninvited, and catching Rose off guard. "I know what's been going on between you and Fred," Elena said, her voice smooth as velvet. "And let me be clear, I won't let you ruin him. You're nothing but a distraction, Rose. He's mine." Rose stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never felt more threatened, more vulnerable than she did in that moment. The cold confidence in Elena's voice, the icy glint in her eyes, it was clear that Elena had no intention of letting Rose have Fred. Not now. Not ever. "You're wrong," Rose said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Fred doesn't belong to anyone. He's not your pawn, Elena, and I'll fight for him, no matter what you think." Elena laughed softly, her gaze cutting. "You think you can fight me, Rose? You've already lost, and I will make sure of it." Fred, meanwhile, was caught in a whirlwind of his own making. He had never been more uncertain, more lost than he was now. Rose's pain, her distrust, and Elena's relentless advances had left him paralyzed. But there was one thing Fred knew for sure. He couldn't live without Rose, and if that meant facing the consequences of his revenge, then he would. As he stood in his office, the city lights flickering outside his window, he made a decision. He would confront Elena once and for all, end the charade, and show Rose the man he truly was. But in doing so, he risked everything: his business, his legacy, his future with Rose. The clock was ticking, and Fred knew that if he didn't act now, he might lose her forever.
As the tension mounted, Rose found herself at a crossroads. Could she forgive Fred for everything he had done? Was love enough to overcome the lies and betrayals? And when it came down to it, who would she choose? Fred, the man who had lied but who she still loved, or Elena, the woman who would stop at nothing to reclaim what she believed was hers? The battle for Fred's heart was far from over, but as the stakes grew higher, the line between love, revenge, and deception blurred more than ever. It had all led to this. Fred knew it, Rose knew it, and Elena knew it. The tensions between them had been escalating for weeks, and now the storm was about to break. Fred had spent the last few days away from both women, locked in his thoughts. His decision was made, but the path ahead was a dangerous one. To finally reveal his true identity to Rose, to confront Elena's ruthless tactics, meant risking everything: the life he had built, the woman he loved, and the fragile relationship they were clinging to. But Fred had reached his breaking point. That night, as the moonlight filtered through their bedroom window, Fred stood before Rose, his heart pounding. He could see the wariness in her eyes, the cold distance she'd put between them ever since she learned the truth. But he also saw something else: the flicker of the love she once had for him. "Rose," Fred began, his voice low but steady, "I can't hide this any longer. I never wanted you to find out like this. I never wanted to hurt you, but I know I've already done that." Rose crossed her arms, her face unreadable. "You're a liar, Fred. You made me believe in something that wasn't real, that wasn't true. You used me, manipulated me, and for what? Revenge? A twisted plan? I don't even recognize the man I married anymore." Fred's throat tightened as her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always known that the truth would hurt her, but the weight of her accusation stung like nothing else. "I'm sorry, Rose," Fred said, his voice cracking. "I never meant for you to be a part of my revenge, but I couldn't let the Browns get away with what they did to you, what they did to me. You were never just a pawn in my game. You were the reason I fought so hard. I loved you. I still love you." Tears welled up in Rose's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. The anger inside her was a storm she couldn't control. "You think that after everything, I can just forget it all? Forget that you lied to me? You've already destroyed whatever we had, Fred. How can I trust you again?" Fred stepped closer, his hand reaching out, but Rose stepped back, shaking her head. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice broken. "Don't you dare." Fred's heart shattered, but he didn't back down. "I'll do anything, Rose, anything to fix this. If you want me to prove my love, to prove that I've changed, I'll do it. Just don't walk away from me, please."
As Fred pleaded with Rose, Elena watched from the shadows, lurking like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had always known this day would come, the day when Fred's lies would catch up with him. But what she hadn't anticipated was how far Fred would go to win Rose back. Her lips curled into a cold, calculated smile as she entered the room, her presence cutting through the air like a blade. "You're wasting your time, Fred," Elena said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She'll never forgive you. You'll never be good enough for her." Fred spun around, his expression hardening as he saw Elena standing there, an unexpected and unwelcome presence in the midst of their fragile confrontation. "What do you want, Elena?" he growled. Elena stepped forward, her eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and malice. "I want what's mine, Fred. I always get what I want, and I've waited long enough. You think you can just walk away from me and go back to her?" She laughed, the sound empty and hollow. "She'll never understand you the way I do. She'll never be able to forgive you, not like I can." Rose looked from Fred to Elena, her confusion giving way to something darker: suspicion. "What's going on here, Fred?" she demanded, her voice low and steady, though her hands were trembling. Fred's gaze shifted between the two women, his mind racing as Elena's words sank in. He had never intended to drag Rose into his past, into the world of manipulation and power struggles. But now, Elena's presence was undeniable. She was a part of his life that he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. "This is who I really am, Rose," Fred said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've always been tangled in this web of lies and power. Elena was part of my past, and maybe she's part of my future too. Rose's face paled as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Elena had been right all along. Fred had never been the man he promised to be. He had been using her all along, even if the truth was more complicated than that. No, Rose said, shaking her head slowly, almost as if she couldn't believe the words that were coming out of his mouth. I won't be part of this anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of betrayal and broken trust crushing them both. Fred could see it in Rose's eyes. She was done. She had fought for their love, for their marriage, but now she was walking away. You can't just walk away from me, Rose, Fred said, his voice desperate as he reached out for her. Please don't leave. I will fix this. I'll leave Elena. I'll do anything you want. Just don't leave me. But Rose had already made up her mind. You had your chance, Fred. You lied to me. You made me believe in something that wasn't real. And now it's too late. With that, she turned on her heel, walking out of the room without looking back. Fred stood frozen, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. He had played the game, thinking he could win her back. But in the end, it was his lies, his manipulations, that had led to this moment of irreparable loss. The next few days were a blur for Fred. The city outside his office window seemed like a foreign place, distant and cold. Rose was gone, and so was his chance for redemption. Elena had made her move, claiming the space that Fred had once hoped to keep for himself and Rose. Fred stood at a crossroads, knowing he could never undo the damage he had done. The battle for Rose's heart was lost, and now he was left with nothing but the remnants of his shattered empire. And yet deep down, Fred couldn't let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to make things right. He wasn't sure how, but he would try. The days after Rose left were the hardest of Fred's life. The emptiness in their home was deafening, the silence in their once lively apartment unbearable. The only sound that echoed in his mind was the final words Rose had said before walking out. It's too late. Fred tried to move on, focusing on work, the only thing that gave him some semblance of purpose. But every moment without Rose felt like a slow death. Elena, ever the opportunist, attempted to fill the void, but Fred could no longer deceive himself into believing that her presence could replace Rose's warmth. He spent hours replaying his actions, dissecting every decision, every lie, wondering if there was any way he could undo the damage he had caused. But it was too late to fix the past. The only thing left was to face the consequences of his actions. Determined to regain control of his life, Fred decided to take one final stand against both Elena and his own guilt. He knew that Rose was the only woman who had ever truly seen him, loved him, and understood him. He couldn't let her go without one last effort. One evening, he stood outside the Brown family mansion, the gates looming ahead like a barrier between him and the woman he had lost. He had made a decision. No more hiding. No more secrets. He would confront the truth, no matter the cost. Fred knocked on the door, and when it opened, he found himself face to face with Rose's mother, a woman who had once treated him like an outsider. But this time, Fred was different. This time, he was a man who knew exactly what he wanted. I need to see Rose, Fred said, his voice firm. I owe her the truth. I owe her everything. Inside, Rose had been pacing her room, unsure of what to do next. The pain of Fred's betrayal had been overwhelming, but a part of her had never stopped longing for the man she once knew. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, but above all, the love she once had for him lingered in the corners of her heart. When she heard Fred's voice, she froze. He had come back. She wasn't sure if it was out of regret, guilt, or something else. But she wasn't ready to face him, not yet. Her mother had always been an obstacle in their relationship, and now, as she stepped aside and motioned for Fred to enter, Rose felt a sense of inevitability. She had to face him, even if she didn't want to. When she saw Fred standing in the doorway, his expression filled with determination and sincerity, her heart faltered. He looked like the man she once loved, the man who had promised her forever. But could she trust him again? Fred, Rose whispered, her voice soft, almost broken. What are you doing here? I'm here to beg for your forgiveness, Rose, Fred said, taking a step toward her. I'm here to show you the man I could be, the man I want to be with you. I've lied, I've manipulated, and I've hurt you in ways I can't undo. But I will fight for you. I will fight for us." Rose's chest tightened as his words sank in. She wanted to believe him, wanted to throw herself into his arms and pretend everything could go back to the way it was. But could she? "You think you can fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You think that after everything I can just forgive you and forget? I've been hurt, Fred. I trusted you, and you destroyed that trust. How can you fix that?" Fred reached out, his hand shaking as he gently touched her arm. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't deserve it, but I won't stop trying. I'll prove to you that I can be the man you deserve. The man who will love you without conditions, without lies." With a deep breath, Rose reached out and took Fred's hand. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again," she said softly, "but I'm willing to try. For us, for what we once had." Fred's heart swelled with a mix of relief and hope. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, he believed they could rebuild what had been broken. Fred and Rose walked out of the Brown mansion together, their fingers entwined as they faced the unknown future. Elena had been a part of their lives, but she was no longer their focus. The road to redemption would be difficult, filled with obstacles and challenges, but Fred was no longer the man who hid behind lies and deceit. He was a man ready to fight for the woman he loved. And as they walked toward their future, Fred knew that love, no matter how complicated or painful, was worth fighting for. The journey of love and redemption is never easy, and Fred's path to forgiveness was filled with twists and turns. But what happens when the past comes crashing into the present and true love faces the ultimate test? Will Fred and Rose overcome their struggles, or will the shadows of betrayal forever haunt them? Stay tuned for more dramatic twists in our next story, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intense love tales. Share your thoughts. What would you do in Fred's shoes?